In the year 1274, on a small island between Korea and Japan, something happened that would haunt the Japanese people for centuries. Imagine standing on a beach, watching the horizon turn black with ships. Not 10 ships, not 100, but 900 vessels carrying 40,000 warriors who had already conquered half the known world. They were coming for you, and what they brought with them was unlike anything Japan had ever seen. This is the story of the Battle of Tsushima, where honor met brutality, where ancient traditions collided with merciless conquest, and where the screams of the dying would echo across centuries. What happened on that island wasn't just a battle, it was a nightmare made real. The year is 1274. The Mongol Empire, under the command of Kublai Khan, grandson of the legendary Genghis Khan, had already swallowed China, Korea, and vast swaths of Asia and Europe. Their armies were unstoppable, their tactics were revolutionary, and their reputation for absolute brutality preceded them like a dark shadow. Now Kublai Khan turned his eyes toward Japan, an island nation that had never been successfully invaded, a land of warriors who lived by a code called Bushido, the way of the warrior. But Kublai Khan didn't care about codes or honor. He cared about submission, and he was about to send a message that would be written in blood. The island of Tsushima sits in the Korea Strait, roughly halfway between the Korean peninsula and mainland Japan. It's a beautiful place, with rugged coastlines, dense forests, and small fishing villages where life had remained relatively unchanged for generations. The island was home to approximately 80 samurai warriors and their retainers, a tiny garrison compared to what was coming. These men were under the command of Sō Sukekuni, the deputy governor of Tsushima. Sō Sukekuni was not a young man, but he was a seasoned warrior who understood the weight of responsibility. His duty was clear: protect the island and its people. What he didn't know, what he couldn't possibly know, was that he and his men were about to face the largest amphibious invasion force the world had ever seen. On November 5, 1274, the Mongol fleet appeared on the horizon. Villagers along the coast stood frozen in terror as they watched the sea itself seem to darken. Ship after ship emerged from the morning mist, their sails bearing the symbols of the Mongol Empire and the subjugated Korean kingdom of Goryeo. The invasion force consisted of approximately 900 ships carrying between 23,000 and 40,000 troops. These weren't just Mongol warriors. The invasion force included ethnic Mongols, Chinese soldiers, Korean auxiliaries, and warriors from every conquered territory of the vast empire. They brought with them weapons and tactics that Japan had never encountered: gunpowder bombs, poisoned arrows, massed cavalry tactics, and, perhaps most terrifying of all, a complete disregard for the rules of warfare that governed samurai combat. The samurai code of Bushido emphasized honor above all else. A proper battle began with challenges, with warriors announcing their names and lineages, with single combat between worthy opponents. This ritualized warfare had defined Japanese military culture for centuries. The Mongols had no such traditions. They fought to win by any means necessary. They used terror as a weapon. They believed in overwhelming force, in psychological warfare, in making examples of those who resisted. The clash between these two worldviews would not just be a military confrontation, it would be a collision of civilizations that would traumatize an entire nation. As the Mongol fleet approached the beaches of Tsushima, Sō Sukekuni made a decision that he knew would likely mean his death. He could have retreated, could have abandoned the island to save his men and regroup on mainland Kyushu, but that would have meant abandoning the civilians, the farmers, the fishermen, the women and children who had no way to escape. It would have meant failing in his duty as a samurai and as a protector. So he gathered his 80 warriors, looked each man in the eye, and prepared to face an army 500 times their size. They knew they would die. The only question was how many of the enemy they could take with them, and how much time they could buy for the messengers racing toward Kyushu to warn of the invasion. The first Mongol soldiers hit the beach at Komoda on the western shore of Tsushima. What happened next would be recounted in horrified whispers for generations. The Mongols didn't just attack, they orchestrated a performance of terror. As the samurai forces assembled to meet them in traditional formation, the Mongols unleashed their first surprise: bombs. These weren't the sophisticated explosives of modern warfare, but they were devastating to warriors who had never encountered gunpowder. The tetsuhao, or iron bombs, were ceramic or metal spheres filled with gunpowder that exploded with thunderous noise and flying shrapnel. Contemporary Japanese accounts describe the sound as unlike anything they had ever heard, like thunder falling from a clear sky. Horses panicked, some samurai froze in confusion, and in that moment of hesitation, the Mongol cavalry charged. The samurai expected individual combat. They expected opponents to announce themselves, to engage in duels of skill and honor. Instead, they faced coordinated units moving in perfect synchronization. Mongol archers, among the finest in the world, loosed volley after volley of arrows while remaining safely out of range of Japanese bows. When the samurai charged forward to close the distance, they ran directly into prepared positions where Mongol infantry awaited with spears, swords, and axes. The coordination was ruthless, the efficiency was terrifying, and the killing was mechanical. But the true horror wasn't just the military tactics, it was what came after each engagement. The Mongols had a policy toward resistance that they had perfected across dozens of conquered territories, complete and utter brutality toward anyone who fought back, designed to break the will of those who heard about it. When they overran the first defensive position, they didn't simply kill the defending samurai, they captured the wounded, and what they did next would become a recurring nightmare throughout the invasion. The Mongols practiced systematic mutilation of prisoners, especially warriors who had fought bravely. They believed this served multiple purposes. It demoralized remaining defenders, it provided a gruesome warning to others, and, according to some historical accounts, it served ritualistic purposes connected to shamanic Mongol traditions about preventing enemy spirits from seeking revenge in the afterlife. Captured samurai were subjected to torture that Japanese warriors had never conceived of in their honor-bound culture. Fingers were removed one by one, eyes were gouged out while men were still alive. Some were flayed partially, kept alive in agony as examples. The screams of these men being tortured could be heard echoing across the island, a psychological weapon as effective as any bomb. But even this wasn't the worst of what the Mongols brought to Tsushima. As they advanced through the island, they came upon villages. The Mongol policy toward civilian populations in resistant territories was brutally simple. Men of fighting age were killed or enslaved, women were subjected to mass rape and then killed or enslaved, children were taken as slaves or killed depending on their age and perceived usefulness, and entire communities were burned to the ground as examples. This wasn't the random violence of an undisciplined army, this was systematic terror, executed with chilling efficiency. In one village, whose name has been lost to history, Mongol soldiers reportedly gathered all the inhabitants in the central square. The men were separated from women and children. The village elder, trying to negotiate, trying to offer tribute and submission, was beheaded in front of everyone as an example. Then the systematic slaughter began. Japanese chronicles from the period, though often written decades later, describe scenes of such horror that Buddhist monks struggled to find words for them. Women were violated in front of their families before being killed. Children who cried were silenced with brutal efficiency. Those who tried to flee were run down by Mongol cavalry, who treated the pursuit as sport, practicing their archery on running targets. The Mongols had a particularly cruel practice involving captive women that appears in multiple historical accounts from their various conquests. Women deemed suitable were bound together with ropes passed through holes punched in their palms, creating human chains that could be marched back to the ships as slaves. The pain was excruciating. Many women bled to death from these wounds during the march. Those who fell were cut loose and left to die. This practice served the dual purpose of making escape nearly impossible while maximizing the number of captives that could be controlled by a small number of guards. Meanwhile, Sō Sukekuni and his remaining warriors fought a desperate running battle across the island. They were samurai, trained from childhood in the arts of war, skilled with bow and blade, conditioned to face death without fear. But they were also human beings watching their world end. Every defensive position they established was eventually overwhelmed by sheer numbers. Every time they fell back, they discovered villages that had been transformed into charnel houses. The smoke from burning homes darkened the sky. The smell of death hung over everything. Contemporary accounts describe Sō Sukekuni personally fighting in the thick of battle, his sword red with blood, his armor dented and pierced, refusing to retreat even as his men died around him. In the samurai tradition, he would have been seeking an honorable death in combat. But the Mongols had learned from fighting the Chinese and Koreans that leaders were more valuable captured than killed. A dead leader became a martyr. A captured leader could be broken, paraded, used to convince others to surrender. When Sō Sukekuni finally fell, it wasn't a clean death in the heat of battle. He was dragged down by multiple soldiers specifically instructed to take him alive. What happened next was designed to be witnessed and reported. The Mongol commanders had him brought before them, stripped of his armor, and offered a choice: renounce his loyalty to the Japanese emperor, swear fealty to Kublai Khan, and help convince other Japanese leaders to surrender peacefully, or face a death that would serve as an example. Sō Sukekuni refused. The chronicles say he spat at the Mongol commander's feet. For this defiance, he was subjected to tortures that Japanese scribes struggled to describe in their later accounts. He was suspended by his wrists, with weights attached to his ankles, slowly dislocating his shoulders. Hot irons were applied to his flesh. Bamboo splints were driven under his fingernails, and through it all, witnesses reported, he refused to scream, refused to give the Mongols the satisfaction of breaking him. When he finally died, his body was mutilated and displayed on the beach as a warning to any Japanese reinforcements that might arrive. Of the 80 samurai who had defended Tsushima, none survived, but their sacrifice had bought time. Messengers had reached Kyushu. The warning had been delivered. Japan now knew that the Mongols were coming, and they knew exactly what to expect if they failed to stop them. The reports from Tsushima's survivors, the few civilians who had managed to hide or escape, described horrors that seemed almost impossible to believe. An enemy that fought without honor, weapons that exploded with thunder, a willingness to inflict suffering that went beyond anything in Japanese military tradition. But the nightmare of Tsushima was only the beginning. After subduing the island in less than a day, the Mongol fleet regrouped and prepared to move on to its next target, the island of Iki, which lay closer to mainland Kyushu. If Tsushima had been a demonstration of Mongol military efficiency, Iki would become a showcase of their capacity for absolute brutality. Because on Iki, they would encounter not just samurai warriors, but a leader whose defiance would inspire an even more terrible response. Iki was larger than Tsushima and had a bigger garrison. The island was commanded by Taira Kagetaka, a samurai of the Hojo clan, which effectively controlled Japan through the shogunate. Taira Kagetaka was a different kind of warrior than Sō Sukekuni. Where Sō had been methodical and dutiful, Taira was passionate and aggressive. When news reached him of what had happened on Tsushima, when he heard the descriptions of how the Mongols had tortured Sō Sukekuni, how they had butchered civilians, how they had desecrated the bodies of fallen samurai, Taira Kagetaka made a vow. He would make the Mongols pay for every foot of ground they took on Iki. He would make them remember Japanese resistance. The Mongol fleet arrived at Iki on November 6th. This time, the Japanese were more prepared. Taira Kagetaka had positioned his roughly 100 samurai and several hundred armed peasants in strategic positions around the likely landing beaches. He had gathered the civilian population in the island's interior and assigned warriors to protect them. He had prepared fire arrows and oil to use against the Mongol ships. He understood that he couldn't win, but he was determined to inflict maximum casualties, to slow the Mongol advance, to buy more time for Kyushu to prepare its defenses. The battle for Iki lasted longer than the battle for Tsushima, but the outcome was never in doubt. The Mongols landed in overwhelming force, established beachheads, and began their methodical advance inland. But this time, they encountered fiercer resistance. Taira Kagetaka had studied what little information existed about Mongol tactics. He avoided massed formations that would be vulnerable to the explosive bombs. He used the terrain, the forests and hills of Iki, to negate the Mongol cavalry advantage. He organized hit-and-run attacks that inflicted casualties before melting back into the landscape. For a brief time, it seemed like Japanese tactics might find an answer to Mongol superiority. The samurai of Iki killed hundreds of Mongol soldiers in the first day of fighting. They burned several Mongol ships at anchor. They created enough chaos that the Mongol advance slowed to a crawl. But the Mongols didn't panic. They didn't become discouraged. They simply adjusted. They brought more troops ashore. They burned the forests where samurai hid. They used their Korean conscripts, considered expendable, to probe Japanese positions and draw out defenders. And slowly, inexorably, they tightened the noose. On the second day of fighting, Taira Kagetaka's forces were pushed back to the island's interior. The civilians they had tried to protect were now caught in the combat zone, and the Mongols, frustrated by the resistance, began to implement a policy that would make Tsushima look merciful. They started taking hostages from captured villages and bringing them to the front lines, using them as human shields. Imagine being a samurai, seeing Mongol soldiers advancing behind a wall of your own people, of farmers and fishermen, of elderly men and young children, all bound and driven forward at spear point. Do you shoot? Do you charge? Every option leads to the death of innocents. Some samurai shot anyway, aiming carefully to hit Mongol soldiers between the human shields. Others couldn't bring themselves to do it and held their fire, allowing the Mongols to advance. The psychological torture of this tactic was exquisite. The Mongols had found a way to turn Japanese honor and compassion into a weakness, and they exploited it ruthlessly. When the hostages were no longer useful, when the Mongols had advanced to the point where they no longer needed human shields, they didn't release their captives. Instead, in full view of the remaining Japanese defenders, they began executing them. Not quickly, not mercifully. They did it slowly, making sure the samurai could see and hear everything. Men were beheaded one by one. Women and children were killed in ways specifically designed to provoke the Japanese into abandoning their defensive positions and charging in rage. And some samurai did exactly that, breaking ranks to try to save innocents, only to be cut down by waiting Mongol troops who had expected exactly this response. Taira Kagetaka, watching his people being slaughtered, watching his warriors die trying to save them, faced an impossible choice. He could surrender, beg for mercy, and hope the Mongols would spare the remaining civilians, or he could fight to the end, knowing that it meant certain death for everyone. According to the historical accounts, he chose a third option, one that would become legend in Japanese military history. He gathered his remaining warriors, perhaps 50 samurai and 100 armed peasants, and organized a final charge. Not a hopeless banzai charge driven by desperation, but a calculated assault aimed at the Mongol command structure. If they could kill the Mongol commanders, throw the invasion force into disarray, perhaps the surviving civilians might have a chance to escape to boats, to flee to Kyushu. The charge began at dawn on the third day. Taira Kagetaka led from the front, his sword gleaming in the early light, his voice raised in a war cry that echoed across the battlefield. The Japanese warriors smashed into the Mongol lines with the fury of men who had nothing left to lose. For a few glorious moments, it seemed like it might work. They broke through the first defensive line. They killed dozens of Mongol soldiers. They actually reached the area where the Mongol commanders had established their headquarters. But the Mongols were the most experienced military force in the world. They had faced desperate charges before, from Poles, from Hungarians, from Chinese armies 10 times the size of this small band. Their discipline held, their reserves moved into position, and within an hour, the charge had been surrounded and annihilated. Taira Kagetaka fought until he could barely lift his sword, his body covered in wounds, standing over the bodies of his fallen comrades. When he finally fell, it was to a Mongol arrow in the back, fired by an archer he never saw. But unlike Sō Sukekuni, Taira Kagetaka died in battle, died on his feet with his sword in his hand. The Mongols couldn't parade him as a broken captive, and this frustrated them, so they took their frustration out on Iki itself. What followed was 3 days of systematic destruction that went beyond military necessity, beyond even the brutal standards the Mongols had already established. It was punishment. It was a message. It was an attempt to break the Japanese will to resist before the invasion reached Kyushu. Every building on Iki was burned. Every villager who had survived the battle was rounded up. The Mongols separated them by age and gender, and what they did next was documented in Japanese chronicles with a horror that still resonates across centuries. Men were tied to stakes on the beach and used for archery practice, shot with arrows from increasing distances to improve Mongol marksmanship. They were kept alive for hours, stuck with dozens of arrows, screaming in agony, while Mongol soldiers treated their suffering as entertainment. Women of all ages were subjected to systematic rape by multiple soldiers. Those who resisted were tortured first. Those who fought back had their resistance broken in ways that Japanese scribes could barely bring themselves to describe. When the Mongol soldiers were finished, many of these women were killed anyway, their bodies thrown into mass graves that were only discovered centuries later when construction projects on the island unearthed the remains. Children faced perhaps the cruelest fate of all. The very young, those deemed too small to be useful as slaves, were killed immediately. Slightly older children were gathered together, and the Mongols practiced a form of psychological warfare that had proven effective in their other conquests. They forced children to watch their parents being tortured and killed, breaking their spirits before enslaving them. The trauma this created was intentional. Traumatized children became compliant slaves, too broken to resist, too damaged to organize rebellion. But there was one practice the Mongols employed on Iki that stands out as particularly horrific, even in this catalog of atrocities. They had discovered on Tsushima that Japanese civilians would sometimes hide in caves or remote locations, hoping to wait out the invasion. On Iki, when they found such hiding places, they didn't just kill those inside. They sealed the caves with the people still living inside, entombing them alive. Families suffocated together in the darkness, their final hours unimaginable. Some of these sealed caves were only discovered in the 20th century, when archaeologists found skeletons of entire families huddled together, parents holding children in their final moments. By the time the Mongols finished with Iki, the island was effectively dead. An estimated 1,000 Japanese had perished, nearly the entire population. The survivors, a few hundred enslaved civilians and perhaps a handful who had managed to escape to sea, carried with them memories of horror that would never fade. The Mongols loaded their ships with plunder and slaves, and on November 9, 1274, they set sail for Kyushu for the final phase of their invasion. News of what had happened on Tsushima and Iki had now reached all of Japan. The shogun's government was mobilizing every available warrior. Temples were offering prayers. Buddhist monks were preaching that the invasion was a divine test of Japanese resolve. But there was also fear, deep and pervasive, because the reports from Tsushima and Iki described an enemy unlike anything in Japanese experience. An enemy that didn't just want to conquer, but to terrorize. An enemy that treated cruelty as a weapon, as important as swords or bows. The Mongol fleet approached Hakata Bay on the northern coast of Kyushu on November 19th. Here, finally, they would face organized Japanese resistance. The Japanese had had time to prepare defensive positions along the beaches. They had assembled several thousand samurai from clans across Kyushu. They had built fortifications and prepared strategies specifically designed to counter what they had learned about Mongol tactics from the survivors of Tsushima and Iki. The initial landings at Hakata Bay saw fierce fighting. This time, the Japanese didn't fight in the traditional manner they had learned. They used massed archery volleys to counter the Mongol arrows. They avoided close formations that would be vulnerable to the explosive bombs. They fought with a desperation born from knowing exactly what would happen if they lost. And for the first time, the Mongol advance stalled. They established beachheads, but they couldn't break through the Japanese defensive lines. The fighting devolved into a brutal stalemate, with both sides taking heavy casualties. But then, on the night of November 19th to November 20th, something extraordinary happened. A storm struck Hakata Bay with tremendous force. Typhoon-strength winds battered the Mongol fleet. Ships were torn from their anchors and driven onto rocks. Others collided in the darkness, splintering and sinking. The Mongol vessels, designed for the calmer waters of the Korean Strait, were simply not built to handle the full fury of a Pacific typhoon. By morning, hundreds of ships had been destroyed or severely damaged. The Mongol commanders, facing massive losses and with their supply line cut, made the decision to withdraw. They loaded their remaining troops onto the surviving ships and retreated back towards Korea. The invasion of 1274 was over. Japan had survived, but the cost had been staggering. Tsushima and Iki had been devastated. Thousands of Japanese had died, most of them civilians. The trauma of the invasion would shape Japanese military policy and national consciousness for generations. The Japanese called the storm that saved them a kamikaze, a divine wind sent by the gods to protect Japan. In reality, it was likely just meteorological fortune, a typhoon that happened to strike at exactly the right moment. But the myth of divine protection would become central to Japanese national identity, the belief that Japan was special, that the gods themselves would defend it against foreign invasion. But the Mongols weren't finished. Kublai Khan had not become the ruler of the largest empire in history by giving up after one setback. For 7 years he prepared a second invasion, one that would be even larger than the first. And when it came in 1281, it would bring new horrors, new demonstrations of Mongol ruthlessness. But it would also prove that what happened on Tsushima and Iki had not been in vain. The sacrifice of Sō Sukekuni, Taira Kagetaka, and the defenders of those islands had bought Japan time to prepare. Their deaths delivered a warning, and the memory of what the Mongols had done to them had created a determination in the Japanese people to resist at any cost. The second invasion came with an even larger fleet, over 4,000 ships, carrying as many as 140,000 troops. The Mongols remembered the resistance they had faced. This time, they planned to bring overwhelming force to crush Japanese resistance so completely that surrender would be the only option. They landed again in Hakata Bay, and again they were met with fierce Japanese resistance. But this time, the Japanese had built defensive walls along the coast. They had prepared fire ships to attack the Mongol fleet. They had trained specifically to counter Mongol tactics. The fighting in 1281 was even more brutal than in 1274. For weeks, battles raged along the coast of Kyushu. The Mongols couldn't break through the Japanese defensive positions. The Japanese couldn't drive the Mongols back into the sea. The stalemate stretched on, with both sides suffering horrific casualties. And then, in mid-August, another typhoon struck. This one was even more powerful than the storm of 1274. It completely annihilated the Mongol fleet, drowning tens of thousands of soldiers, scattering the survivors, ending Kublai Khan's dream of conquering Japan. The devastation wrought by the typhoons of 1274 and 1281 created a maritime graveyard that would haunt the waters around Japan for centuries. But to understand the true horror of what happened during those invasions, we need to look beyond the battles themselves and examine the aftermath, the long-term consequences, and the individual stories that emerged from the carnage. Because the brutality of the Mongol invasions wasn't limited to the battlefield. It extended into every aspect of the conflict, from the treatment of prisoners to the fate of those enslaved, from the psychological trauma inflicted on survivors to the ways both sides adapted their tactics to inflict maximum suffering on their enemies. Let us return to those first days after the 1274 invasion, when Japanese authorities began the grim task of assessing the damage to Tsushima and Iki. Search parties sent to the islands discovered scenes that hardened warriors described as unbearable. On Tsushima, entire villages had been burned to ash. The bodies of civilians lay where they had fallen, often mutilated in ways that served no military purpose. Women had been killed in positions that made clear what had been done to them before death. Children's bodies were found clustered together in locations where they had clearly tried to hide, hunted down and slaughtered like animals. But perhaps the most disturbing discoveries were the survivors. Those few civilians who had managed to hide successfully, who had watched from concealment as their families were murdered, who had heard the screams and been powerless to help. These survivors were found in states of complete psychological collapse. Some had gone mute, unable to speak about what they had witnessed. Others had descended into madness, their minds unable to process the trauma. Buddhist monks who came to Tsushima to perform funeral rites and offer comfort to survivors reported that many of them seemed more dead than alive, hollow shells going through the motions of existence with their spirits utterly broken. The monks faced an almost impossible task. In Buddhist tradition, proper funeral rites were essential for the soul's journey to the next life. But there were too many bodies, many of them so badly burned or decomposed that identification was impossible. Mass graves had to be dug, prayers had to be said for hundreds of unknown dead, and the monks themselves were traumatized by what they saw. Several contemporary accounts mention monks who returned from Tsushima and Iki unable to continue their religious duties, haunted by nightmares, questioning how such evil could exist in the world if Buddha's compassion was real. Meanwhile, across the Korea Strait, a different kind of horror was unfolding. The enslaved Japanese civilians captured on Tsushima and Iki were being transported to various locations within the Mongol Empire. The Mongols had a highly organized slave trade system that had been perfected over decades of conquest. Slaves were categorized by age, gender, and perceived skills, then distributed to locations where they would be most useful. Young, healthy men became laborers, working in mines, on construction projects, or in agricultural fields under brutal conditions. Women became domestic servants or concubines, their lives entirely at the mercy of their owners. Children were often given to Mongol families to raise as servants, deliberately separated from their culture and families to prevent any sense of Japanese identity from persisting. The journey itself was an ordeal that many didn't survive. Packed into the holds of ships, given minimal food and water, forced to exist in their own waste, the enslaved Japanese endured conditions designed not for their welfare, but for maximum efficiency of transport. Those who became sick were often thrown overboard. Those who died were disposed of the same way. By the time the slave ships reached their destinations, a significant percentage of the captives had perished. But the Mongols didn't care. The supply of potential slaves seemed endless. Japan had millions of people. The islands they had raided were just the beginning. Some of these enslaved Japanese left traces in historical records that allow us to glimpse their fates. Chinese chronicles from the Yuan dynasty, the Mongol dynasty that ruled China, mention Japanese slaves working in various capacities. A few, those with particular skills like craftsmanship or literacy, managed to achieve somewhat better conditions by making themselves useful. But most simply disappeared into the vast machinery of the Mongol Empire, worked to death in mines or fields, used and discarded, dying far from home with no one to perform the proper rites for their souls. There is one account, recorded in a Korean chronicle, of a Japanese woman enslaved on Tsushima who managed to escape years later. She had been taken as a young girl, perhaps 12 or 13, and had been given to a Mongol officer as a servant. For years, she endured treatment that the Korean chronicler could only hint at, using euphemisms that still conveyed profound suffering. But she learned the Mongol language, learned their customs, and when her owner died in a campaign against rebels in southern China, she managed to escape in the chaos. She made her way across hundreds of miles, begging, stealing, hiding, driven by an obsession to return to Japan. When she finally reached the Korean coast, she convinced a fisherman to take her across the strait. She returned to Tsushima to find her village gone, her family dead, everything she had known destroyed. The chronicle ends by noting that she became a Buddhist nun, spending the rest of her life praying for the souls of those who had died in the invasion. Back in Japan, the invasions had sparked a massive military buildup. The shogun's government understood that the Mongols would return. Kublai Khan had sent several diplomatic missions to Japan between 1274 and 1281, demanding submission. Each time, the Japanese had refused, and in some cases had executed the Mongol envoys in deliberate violation of diplomatic norms. This was intended as a message of defiance, but it also guaranteed that when the Mongols returned, they would come seeking not just conquest, but revenge. The Japanese preparation for the second invasion involved innovations in military technology and tactics that directly responded to what they had learned about Mongol warfare. They studied the accounts from survivors of Tsushima and Iki. They questioned Korean prisoners taken in minor raids. They even managed to capture a few Mongol stragglers from the 1274 invasion and extract information from them through interrogation methods that matched Mongol brutality, demonstrating that the Japanese were willing to abandon their traditional honor codes when survival was at stake. One of the key innovations was the construction of defensive walls along vulnerable coastal areas, particularly around Hakata Bay. These weren't simple wooden palisades, but substantial stone constructions designed to prevent easy beach landings. The Japanese had observed that much of the Mongol tactical advantage came from their ability to quickly establish beachheads and deploy their cavalry. Walls disrupted this advantage, forcing the Mongols to fight on foot in confined spaces where Japanese swordsmanship could compete more effectively. But the Japanese also developed new weapons and tactics that were explicitly designed not just to defeat the Mongols, but to terrorize them. They created fire ships, vessels packed with combustible materials that could be set ablaze and sailed into the Mongol fleet. They developed longer spears specifically to counter Mongol cavalry charges. And perhaps most tellingly, they began training samurai in methods of psychological warfare that mirrored some of the Mongol tactics that had proven so effective. Japanese commanders who had witnessed the carnage on Tsushima and Iki understood that the Mongols used terror as a weapon. They had seen how the systematic brutality had been designed to break Japanese will to resist, and some Japanese leaders concluded that the only way to counter this was to show the Mongols that Japanese warriors could be equally brutal, that resistance would cost the invaders so dearly in blood that even if they conquered Japan, it would be a Pyrrhic victory not worth the price. This represented a significant shift in samurai culture. The traditional Bushido code emphasized honorable combat, mercy to defeated enemies, and respect for the dead. But the Mongol invasions challenged these principles. How do you maintain honor when fighting an enemy who has no honor? How do you show mercy to an enemy who shows none? How do you respect the dead when your enemy desecrates the bodies of your comrades fallen? These questions created deep philosophical and moral conflicts within the samurai class, conflicts that would influence Japanese military culture for centuries. When the second invasion came in 1281, both sides brought a heightened level of brutality to the conflict. The Mongol force was divided into two fleets, an eastern route fleet from Korea carrying approximately 40,000 troops, and a larger southern route fleet from China carrying perhaps 100,000 troops. The plan was for these fleets to converge at Iki, resupply, and then launch a coordinated assault on Kyushu with overwhelming force. The eastern route fleet arrived first in early June 1281. Once again, Tsushima was the first target. The island had been partially repopulated in the 7 years since the first invasion, though many areas remained abandoned, haunted by the memories of what had happened. The small garrison of samurai stationed there knew what was coming. They had built defensive positions, they had prepared evacuation routes for civilians, but they also knew that against such overwhelming numbers, their chances of survival were virtually zero. This time, the slaughter was even worse because both sides knew what to expect. The Mongols remembered the fierce resistance they had encountered on Iki in 1274. They were determined to crush any opposition so completely that word of it would precede them to Kyushu. The Japanese defenders, knowing the fate that awaited them and any civilians captured alive, fought with the desperation of the doomed. The battle for Tsushima in 1281 lasted only a day, but the intensity of the fighting was extraordinary. Japanese accounts describe samurai warriors fighting in a trance-like state, so focused on killing as many Mongols as possible that they seemed to feel no pain from their wounds. One samurai, whose name appears in later chronicles as Kono Michiari, reportedly killed more than 30 Mongol soldiers before he was finally brought down. Even then, wounded and surrounded, he continued fighting on his knees until he bled out. The Mongols, frustrated by this fanatical resistance, responded with even greater brutality in the aftermath. This time, they didn't just execute prisoners and civilians, they deliberately created displays of horror designed to be seen by Japanese forces on the next island. Bodies were mutilated in specific ways, arranged in patterns, left as messages. Survivors who were allowed to escape, often after being maimed, were explicitly told to carry word of what they had seen to Kyushu. The Mongols had learned that psychological warfare was effective against the Japanese, and they intensified it. On Iki, the pattern repeated, but with an even more disturbing element. The Mongols had brought with them Korean conscripts who harbored their own grievances against Japan. Korea had suffered raids from Japanese pirates for centuries. Japanese woku, or pirates, had pillaged Korean coastal villages, enslaved Korean civilians, and created a legacy of hatred. Now, Korean soldiers in the Mongol army had an opportunity for revenge, and some of them pursued it with enthusiasm that shocked even the Mongol commanders. Korean troops were reportedly responsible for some of the worst atrocities on Iki. They identified Japanese prisoners who might be related to known pirate families and subjected them to torture that went beyond even Mongol standards. There are accounts of Korean soldiers forcing Japanese captives to watch as their family members were slowly killed, then offering them the choice to convert to Buddhism as practiced in Korea and swear loyalty to the Mongol Khan or face the same fate. Those who converted were often killed anyway, their conversions deemed insincere. This element of the invasion, the use of Korean troops to commit atrocities against Japanese civilians, created a layer of ethnic hatred that would poison relations between Japan and Korea for centuries. It demonstrated how the Mongols were skilled at exploiting existing tensions and hatreds, using conquered peoples against each other, ensuring that resistance to Mongol rule was divided and weakened by internal conflicts. By the time the Eastern Route fleet finished with Tsushima and Iki and moved on to establish positions in Hakata Bay, they had created a trail of devastation that had achieved its psychological purpose. Word reached Kyushu not just of military defeat, but of horrors beyond imagination. Buddhist temples filled with civilians seeking sanctuary and praying for deliverance. Samurai prepared for battle with the understanding that this might be the end of Japan as they knew it. The shogun's government issued orders that under no circumstances could Japan surrender, that every man, woman, and child would die resisting before submitting to Mongol rule. The battles along Hakata Bay in June and July of 1281 were among the most intense in the entire history of the Mongol Empire. The Japanese had prepared extensive fortifications, they had assembled an army of samurai larger than any previously gathered, and they fought with a determination born from knowing exactly what defeat meant. But the Mongols had numbers, experience, and their own determination. Kublai Khan had invested enormous resources in this invasion. Failure was not acceptable. The fighting devolved into a prolonged stalemate. The Mongols could establish beachheads but couldn't break through the defensive walls. The Japanese could hold their positions but couldn't drive the Mongols back into the sea. And so the battle ground on, day after day, week after week. Both sides suffered enormous casualties. The beaches of Hakata Bay became charnel grounds where thousands of bodies rotted in the summer heat. The smell of death hung over everything. Disease began to spread through both camps. During this period, both sides committed acts that would have been considered atrocities in any era. Japanese night raids on Mongol encampments specifically targeted Korean and Chinese conscripts, killing them in ways designed to terrorize the ethnic Mongol officers. Mongol retaliation involved burning nearby Japanese villages and bringing the civilian casualties to the front lines to execute them within sight of Japanese defensive positions. It became a war of mutual atrocity, each side trying to break the other's will through demonstrations of ruthlessness. One incident that appears in multiple Japanese accounts involved a group of Mongol soldiers who captured a Japanese temple that had been serving as a hospital for wounded samurai. Rather than simply killing the wounded warriors and the monks tending them, the Mongols turned it into a spectacle of cruelty. They brought the wounded outside, tied them to stakes, and slowly tortured them to death over the course of hours while forcing the monks to watch. When the monks tried to pray for the dying men, they were beaten. When they tried to look away, they were forced to keep watching. Only after all the samurai died were the monks themselves killed. This incident became famous in Japan as an example of Mongol depravity, and it was cited for centuries as justification for Japan's isolationist policies. But the Japanese were not innocent victims in this exchange of horrors. There are accounts of Japanese warriors who captured Mongol soldiers and subjected them to ritual torture that incorporated elements of religious practice. Some Buddhist sects had developed interpretations of their faith that justified killing in defense of the Dharma. These beliefs were used to rationalize treatment of Mongol prisoners that went beyond military necessity. Captured Mongols were sometimes offered to temples as living sacrifices, where monks would perform elaborate rituals while slowly killing them, believing that they were purifying corrupted souls through suffering. The samurai Takezaki Suenaga, whose illustrated scrolls of the Mongol invasions provide much of our visual evidence for these events, personally participated in raids that captured Mongol soldiers. His scrolls show these prisoners being executed, but contemporary written accounts suggest that what actually happened was far worse than what could be depicted in artwork intended for presentation to the shogunate. Suenaga's own diary entries, discovered centuries later, describe interrogating Mongol prisoners using methods that involved systematic mutilation to force them to reveal tactical information. The diary makes clear that Suenaga felt no moral qualms about this, viewing the Mongols as less than human, as demons in human form who deserved whatever suffering could be inflicted upon them. This dehumanization of the enemy was mutual and absolute. To the Mongols, the Japanese were stubborn barbarians refusing to accept the inevitable, resisting the divinely ordained expansion of the Mongol Empire. Their resistance was irrational and therefore deserved to be punished with exemplary cruelty. To the Japanese, the Mongols were foreign demons threatening everything sacred about Japan, violating the land blessed by the kami, the Shinto gods. Their invasion was a spiritual pollution that had to be cleansed with their blood. As July turned to August, the stalemate continued. Both sides were exhausted. The Mongol fleet was cramped in Hakata Bay, ships anchored close together, waiting for the southern route fleet to arrive with reinforcements. The Japanese defensive positions were holding, but barely. The samurai were physically and mentally drained from weeks of constant combat. Something had to break. And then, on August 15, 1281, the kamikaze struck. The typhoon that hit Hakata Bay that night was one of the most powerful storms ever recorded in that region. Winds that felt like the fists of angry gods smashed into the Mongol fleet. The ships, packed together in the bay, had nowhere to maneuver. They collided with each other, crushing hulls, tangling rigging, creating a chaos of splintering wood and drowning men. Waves as tall as buildings swept across the decks, washing away soldiers, supplies, everything. The roar of the wind was so loud that men standing next to each other couldn't hear their own screams. The Mongol fleet was annihilated. Ships that weren't sunk outright were driven onto rocks or beaches, breaking apart under the relentless assault of wind and waves. The southern route fleet, approaching from the south, was caught in open water and suffered even more catastrophic losses. By morning, the sea was choked with wreckage and bodies. An estimated 70 to 90% of the invasion force had been killed, drowned in a single night. The survivors who washed up on Japanese beaches faced samurai who showed them no mercy. This was revenge for Tsushima, for Iki, for all the atrocities the Mongols had committed. The Japanese killed every Mongol soldier they could find. There are accounts of Mongol soldiers crawling onto beaches, exhausted and injured from the storm, being met by Japanese warriors who executed them on the spot. Some were decapitated, their heads collected as trophies. Others were taken prisoner, only to be used in religious ceremonies, sacrificed to give thanks to the kami, the Shinto gods. The fury of Japanese revenge matched the cruelty the Mongols had shown at Tsushima and Iki. The cycle of atrocity had come full circle. In the aftermath of the second invasion, Kublai Khan considered a third attempt. For years he ordered preparations for another assault on Japan, but he never launched it. The losses from the second invasion had been too catastrophic, the expense had been too great, and there were other priorities, other rebellions to suppress, other borders to defend. Japan had survived not through military superiority, but through fortune, geography, and the willingness to resist at any cost. The Mongol Empire, which had conquered half the world, had been stopped by a small island nation and the fury of the Pacific typhoons. But the cost had been staggering. Tsushima and Iki had been devastated twice, their populations decimated, their landscapes scarred by war. Thousands of Japanese had died in the battles on Kyushu. Thousands more had been enslaved, carried off to lives of suffering in distant parts of the Mongol Empire. The psychological trauma affected an entire generation. The economic cost of the military buildup had bankrupted many samurai families and strained the shogunate's finances to the breaking point. The invasions also had profound long-term consequences for Japanese culture and policy. The belief in divine protection, in the kamikaze that had saved Japan, became central to national identity. It fostered a sense of Japanese exceptionalism, the belief that Japan was fundamentally different from other nations, protected by the gods themselves. This belief would persist for centuries, contributing to Japan's isolationist policies during the Edo period, and much later to the militaristic nationalism of the early 20th century. The treatment of foreigners in Japan was also deeply affected by the Mongol invasions. For centuries afterward, Japan viewed outsiders with suspicion bordering on paranoia. The Portuguese who arrived in the 16th century, the Dutch traders who came later, all encountered a Japan that was profoundly distrustful of foreign contact because of the trauma of the Mongol invasions. The policy of sakoku, or national isolation, that Japan maintained from the 17th to the 19th centuries had many causes, but the memory of the Mongol invasions was certainly among them. Within Japanese Buddhism, the invasions sparked theological debates that would reshape the religion. How could a compassionate Buddha allow such suffering? Why had the gods sent the divine wind only after so many had died? These questions led to new schools of thought that emphasized apocalyptic elements in Buddhist teaching, the idea that the world was entering a degenerate age where suffering was inevitable and only through faith could salvation be found. The popularity of Pure Land Buddhism that promised rebirth in a paradise free from suffering grew enormously in the decades after the invasions as people sought comfort from the trauma they had experienced or heard about. The samurai class underwent its own transformation. The traditional emphasis on individual combat and honor had proven inadequate against the Mongol threat. The invasions demonstrated the effectiveness of coordinated group tactics, of defensive fortifications, of weapons like the fire arrow and fire ship that struck from a distance. In the centuries that followed, samurai culture would evolve to incorporate these lessons while maintaining the rhetoric of honor and individual prowess. The Bushido Code became more elaborate and formalized, perhaps as a way of asserting Japanese moral superiority over the dishonorable tactics the Mongols had employed. There was also a darker legacy. The atrocities committed during the invasions by both sides normalized a level of brutality in Japanese warfare that would persist into the modern era. The idea that enemies could be dehumanized, that cruelty was justified in defense of the homeland, that mercy was a luxury Japan couldn't afford, these notions became embedded in military culture. They would resurface in later conflicts, from the civil wars of the Sengoku period to Japan's actions in Asia during World War II. For the individuals who survived the invasions, life was never the same. Many samurai families had been financially ruined by the years of military service, as the government had difficulty paying the promised rewards for military service. There were disputes over compensation that lasted for decades. Some samurai who had distinguished themselves in battle found their claims ignored or underpaid, leading to resentment and social instability. The few civilians who had been enslaved and somehow managed to return to Japan faced a different kind of suffering. They were often viewed with suspicion, as potentially corrupted by their time among the Mongols, as possibly being spies or having converted to foreign ways. Women who had been captured and returned faced particular stigma, with many unable to marry or reintegrate into their communities because of assumptions about what had been done to them. Some of these survivors committed suicide, unable to bear the shame and isolation. Others retreated into religious life, becoming monks or nuns, finding in Buddhism a refuge from a society that couldn't accept them. The environmental damage to Tsushima and Iki was also severe and long-lasting. The forests that had been burned took generations to regrow. Agricultural land that had been trampled by armies and soaked with blood was considered cursed by some, unsuitable for cultivation. Archaeological excavations on both islands have revealed mass graves containing hundreds of bodies, physical evidence of the scale of killing. Some of these graves show signs of having been disturbed in ancient times, suggesting scavengers, both animal and human, had searched the bodies for valuables, adding one final indignity to the dead. In the Mongol Empire, the failed invasions of Japan had their own consequences. Kublai Khan faced criticism from other Mongol leaders for the enormous waste of resources. The preparations and losses from the 2 invasion attempts had cost the equivalent of years of tax revenue from China. The manpower losses, while sustainable for an empire as large as the Mongols, still represented tens of thousands of experienced soldiers who could have been used elsewhere. Some historians argue that the failure to conquer Japan weakened Kublai Khan's prestige and contributed to resistance movements in other parts of the empire. The Korean kingdom of Goryeo, which had been forced to provide ships and soldiers for the invasions, was nearly bankrupted by the effort. The construction of the thousands of ships required for the second invasion had stripped Korea's forests and drained its treasury. Korean resentment of Mongol rule intensified, leading to rebellions that further destabilized the region. In an ironic twist, some of these Korean rebels fled to Japan, where they provided intelligence about Mongol military capabilities and plans, becoming allies of the nation their countrymen had helped invade. The Chinese populations that had been conscripted for the invasions also carried back tales of what they had experienced. Buddhist texts from the late 13th century describe Japan as a land protected by powerful spirits, a place where the natural order itself resisted foreign intrusion. These accounts contributed to a mystique around Japan in Chinese culture that would persist for centuries. Japan became viewed as a mysterious, dangerous place, blessed or cursed depending on one's perspective, a nation that existed at the edge of the known world and was better left alone. Modern archaeological work has provided new insights into the brutality of the invasions. Underwater excavations of the Mongol shipwrecks in Hakata Bay have recovered weapons, armor, and human remains that tell their own stories. Some skeletons found in the wrecks show signs of violent trauma inflicted before the ship sank, suggesting fighting aboard vessels during the typhoon. Others show evidence of being trapped below decks when ships capsized, drowning in darkness as water poured in. The distribution of remains suggests that many ships were so overcrowded that soldiers had no chance of escape when disaster struck. On land, excavations on Tsushima have uncovered evidence that challenges and confirms historical accounts. Mass graves contain bodies buried hastily without the proper Buddhist rites, suggesting the scale of death overwhelmed normal funeral practices. Some skeletons show wounds consistent with the weapons described in historical accounts, both Mongol and Japanese. The presence of women and children in these graves confirms that civilian populations were targeted, that this was not just a military conflict, but a total war aimed at terrorizing an entire population. One particularly haunting discovery was made in the 1990s when construction workers on Tsushima uncovered a sealed cave. Inside were the remains of approximately 30 people, ranging from elderly adults to young children. The positioning of the skeletons suggested they had huddled together as they died, families clinging to each other in the darkness. There were no weapons, no signs of violence on the bones. They had simply been sealed in and left to suffocate, exactly as historical accounts had described the Mongols doing to people they found hiding. The discovery provided physical confirmation of an atrocity that modern historians had hoped might have been exaggerated by medieval chroniclers. The legacy of Tsushima and Iki extends into the modern era in unexpected ways. During World War II, when Japan faced potential invasion by American forces, propagandists invoked the memory of the Kamikaze, the divine wind that had saved Japan from the Mongols. The suicide pilots who flew their aircraft into American ships were named Kamikaze, linking their sacrifice to the mythologized typhoons of 1274 and 1281. The idea that Japan was protected by divine forces, that foreign invasion would inevitably fail, was used to encourage resistance even when military defeat was inevitable. In this way, the trauma and mythology of the Mongol invasions echoed across 7 centuries, continuing to shape Japanese military culture and national consciousness. Today, Tsushima and Iki are peaceful islands, popular with tourists and known for their natural beauty, but the scars remain for those who know where to look. There are monuments to those who died defending the islands. There are shrines dedicated to Sō Sukekuni and Taira Kagetaka, the commanders who led hopeless defenses knowing they would die. There are museums that display artifacts recovered from the battlefield, rusted weapons and fragments of armor that once belonged to men whose names we will never know. Every year, on the anniversaries of the invasions, ceremonies are held to honor the dead. Buddhist monks chant sutras for the souls of those who died, both Japanese and Mongol. Because while the historical narrative focuses on the Japanese perspective, the Mongol soldiers who drowned in the typhoons were also human beings, many of them conscripts who had no choice but to participate in a war they likely didn't understand. Korean sailors who built and crewed the ships were victims of the Mongol Empire as much as the Japanese they invaded. Chinese soldiers forced to fight for their conquerors died far from home, unmourned and unremembered. The invasions created suffering on all sides, and the modern memorial ceremonies attempt to acknowledge this complex reality. The Battle of Tsushima and the broader Mongol invasions of Japan represent a unique moment in history when 2 radically different military cultures collided with catastrophic results. The Mongols brought a style of warfare that prioritized efficiency, terror, and overwhelming force. The Japanese defended with a code that emphasized honor, individual prowess, and spiritual protection. Neither side was fully prepared for what the other brought to the conflict, and the result was an escalation of brutality that shocked both civilizations. The invasions demonstrated that even the most powerful military force in history could be defeated by a combination of determined resistance, effective defensive preparations, and sheer environmental fortune. They showed that terror, while effective in the short term, could also create a level of determination in the enemy that made conquest nearly impossible. They proved that cultural differences in warfare could lead to mutual atrocities as each side abandoned its normal restraints in response to the perceived barbarism of the enemy. For Japan, the invasions became a defining national trauma that shaped policy, culture, and identity for centuries. The memory of what happened on Tsushima and Iki served as both a warning and an inspiration. A warning that the outside world was dangerous and predatory, that foreign contact brought nothing but suffering. An inspiration that Japan could survive any threat, that the gods themselves protected this land, that Japanese spirit and determination could overcome any enemy. For the Mongol Empire, the failure to conquer Japan represented one of the few significant military defeats in their history of conquest. It demonstrated the limits of Mongol power, that there were some places even the greatest empire couldn't subdue. The enormous losses from the invasions contributed to the eventual decline of Mongol naval power and helped convince later Mongol leaders to focus on their vast land empire rather than pursuing further overseas adventures. The brutality of the invasions also contributed to historical memory in ways that extended far beyond Japan and the Mongol Empire. Medieval European accounts of the Mongol invasions of Japan, filtered through multiple translations and cultural interpretations, added to the fearsome reputation of Mongol warfare. Stories of the atrocities, exaggerated through retelling, contributed to European perceptions of the Mongols as an apocalyptic threat. Similarly, Chinese and Korean accounts of what happened influenced those cultures' understandings of both Mongol ruthlessness and Japanese military capabilities. In the end, what happened at Tsushima and Iki in 1274 and 1281 was more than just a military conflict. It was a collision of worldviews, a demonstration of human capacity for both courage and cruelty, and a series of events that would echo through history in ways the participants could never have imagined. The samurai who died defending those islands knew they had no chance of survival, yet they fought anyway to buy time for their countrymen to prepare. That is a form of sacrifice that demands recognition, even as we condemn the atrocities committed during the conflict. The Mongol soldiers who drowned in the typhoons were following orders, fighting for an empire that had given them little choice, and they deserve to be remembered as victims of circumstance as much as any other casualties of this terrible conflict. The Battle of Tsushima and the Mongol invasions of Japan stand as a reminder of the human capacity for both nobility and depravity, often displayed by the same individuals in the same conflict. They remind us that history is not simple, that there are rarely clear heroes and villains, and that the consequences of violence extend far beyond the battlefield and far beyond the lifetimes of those who participate in it. The islands of Tsushima and Iki are beautiful places today, but they are also haunted places where the ghosts of history whisper warnings to those willing to listen. Warnings about the cost of war, the danger of dehumanizing enemies, and the terrible price paid by innocent civilians when empires clash. This is the story that needed to be told, not just a simple narrative of heroic Japanese resistance or brutal Mongol aggression, but the complex, horrifying, deeply human story of what happened when two civilizations met in violence on a small island in 1274 and 1281. It is a story that honors the courage of those who fought while acknowledging the atrocities they committed. It is a story that remembers the victims, both Japanese and Mongol, soldier and civilian, those who died quickly in battle and those who suffered prolonged torment before death or enslavement. It is a story that refuses to forget, because the moment we forget the true cost of such conflicts is the moment we risk repeating them.